What up, YouTube? This one of those, videos I say that may not get failed, and because it's not really something that I consider official. It's just me just talking off the top about what I think is what my understanding really, as far as the Islamic view of Jesus, and then the questions that I have in my head. That's basically like the main theme of it. And so, I'm like, let me look a couple of things up real quick, like some Islamic verses pertaining to Jesus, because this is my understanding so far, right? I'm talking about like all the way up into this period right now, before I decided to do like another like quick little blog about it, which is not really this one. This is just like a test, but like another like real quick blog about it, a more official blog about it, and then make it real, just try not to make it longer than 20 minutes, blah blah blah. But anyway, up until this point, this is my understanding of what they think about Jesus, or was, or is really. That yes, they consider him a prophet. No, they don't believe that he was really born through an immaculate conception. And so, based on my prior readings about a little bit of Christian history, and then some of the arguments that went on between different schools of thought pertaining to Jesus and what they call the Madonna, all right? That consists of the philosophical argument as to the holiness in the religious sense of Mary in Jesus, all right? Mostly dealing with Jesus, whether he was born through an immaculate conception. He threw the term divinity up in there as well, all right? So it's like two people that I know about so far, two main people. One, a guy named Arius, and then another guy named Nestorius. Now, they had a similar view of Jesus, but the main what I think kind of ties both of them together, or at least in the same category, not really together, but not even category, but like I would say under the same umbrella, at least, is that they don't know, none of those schools of thought, as far as my understanding, think of Jesus in the same way people today think of Jesus. The main predominant interpretation of him, which would be called the non-Chalcedonian philosophy back in the day. Today is just the Trinitarian doctrine, all right? They believe the Immaculate Conception belief, okay? So that's like the overall thing. As far as like the history of other kingdoms and all that type of stuff, I ain't gonna go too much into that. So that's basically generally my understanding that separates those two Christian schools of thought back then from what the Islamists believe of Jesus. But I would still sort of put that almost in the, or at least under the same umbrella as far as the Islamic belief in Jesus. I would put that under the same umbrella as those two earlier Christian schools of thought. Why? Because based on a couple of verses and some surahs that I read, but I already knew this already. Even though they believe in Jesus being a prophet, they consider him to be like the most important one. All right, read about it. Some of the terms that throw out is superior, but definitely one that protruded above the rest of the prophets. But the whole essence of it, they don't believe he was born through an immaculate conception. Now, that was my understanding. Now, I read something today that was a little different. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to check another source and parallel this just to make sure this is like the correct interpretation of the Arabian language, all right? Because it was fucking odd. I came across a couple of what I consider to be exotic findings. So one was Jesus. I'm like, okay, let me see as far as like in the Quran what it said about him. One of the verses that I came across, because I read like, I think at least probably like 10 of them, at least 10 verses. first one I started with is for, I guess, you know, I don't know exactly which surah, but I'm assuming it would be book 4 and then verse 157. That's the first one I started out at, and I was trying to get a better understanding, so I read further, then I went back to try to get the whole context, you know what I'm saying, the order, as far as like, okay, who is speaking exactly. But let me not go too off the subject. Starting with the first find. Okay, they mentioned a guy by the name of Imran that I came across. Now, he was a dude, but he also had a wife, and they are the parents of Mary, which is Jesus' mother, right? So later on down the line, as God communicated with Mary as well, she was basically brought to the knowledge that she was going to bear a child that was going to be very special. But she had questions because she had no significant other at the time. So she was asking God, how is she going to be able to do this? Eventually, God sent her a guide. He created a human being and then sent this guy to her. That's the important part. He created this guy. So it wasn't somebody that was already in existence at that time. All right, so that's the part I'm like, what? Now, that's the exotic detail to me. You know, I didn't really know that part. That's the exotic detail. Said he created a human being. This guy went to Mary. They had a conversation. He let her know who he was and what his purpose was. And so they went ahead and they, made it. And that is what engendered the birth of Jesus. All right, this is in the Quran. This is what I read tonight. I was like, what? And that website, that was, let me see, that's the second website that I wrote down some of the information from. I don't know, I took a quick video of it. I can't remember the name of that website, but the first one I went to, which didn't have this information, the way the information that I just told, but it's called namb.net, www.namb, N-A-M-B, and then .net. So anyway, I read that, I was like, what? So I'm thinking it might be a made-up website, because I've seen people make up websites before. I'm like, hold on. So I had never heard that before, so I switched it, went to a couple of ones. It was the same exact verse, only a couple of differences. It was like a couple of words, that's it, but basically the same exact content. So I was like, wow. The reason why I found that to be exotic and interesting is because I still put that under the umbrella of those two earlier Christian philosophies. It's just, okay, as far as Nestorianism and Arianism, I never read Arius' actual writings or anything as close to it concerning that period. Same thing with Nestorius, because we see, again, he was born in 370, and then he died in 450. Something like that. Anyway, he came later. Arius lived around the Nicaea Council period, so that's like around 325. But as far as like their actual writings, I haven't read it yet, but I understand, like, as far as where they're coming from, what the interpretation that they hold regarding Jesus. But as far as what I do know of both of those schools of thought, I never heard anything as far as God creating a man and then this man mating with Mary and then that giving way to Jesus. I thought that was odd, because it kind of twists. It's like, okay, he's not born through an immaculate conception from a Christian standpoint, but at the same time, this human being that God created is not, number one, fashioned the same exact way that us human beings are fashioned, and those human beings were fashioned. You know, it's like it was a glitch in the matrix in this one. You know what I'm saying? This is a special individual, and not only is he immediately grafted, he is automatically imparted, like God imparted him with special information, knowledge, and a mission. And he's the only person from a religious textual standpoint that I would consider I would say the most direct embodiment of the whole created for a purpose dispute, you know what I'm saying, or quarrel, that philosophical quarrel. As far as the story within this particular surah, as far as that portion right there, you know what I'm saying, not arguing whether it's literally true or not, but just the story itself, that's like the man, I don't want to say epitome, but like the central example. That's like the central point of the embodiment of that fucking point of view. The whole, you know, God created every individual for a specific purpose that's different from each other, because a lot of people believe that. But as far as like the story and that, you basically could fit that into that. But anyway, yeah. So that's what makes it a little different. It's like it's a little bit of a supernatural component infused into the mix. You know what I'm saying? That is the part that kind of takes away from or a more so realistic view. All right, that's the first part. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to look into that. So like the second article that I read, you know, because I typed in the keywords, I googled the keywords, like, man, you know, surahs dealing with Jesus or something like that. So a good ass motherfucking article came up, and it's like a 3-part series, or a good ass website came up, and it was a 3-part series. I can't remember if it's video also, but anyway, they had like a whole list of verses and surahs basically that you can go to, where you know that. You know, they listed it in chronological order, starting from Imran, Mary, of course, down to Jesus, and then like the little tokens within the story itself, like the birth of Jesus, and you know, like that little type of shit. Anyway, they had all of that in order, so I had wrote them all down, and like I said, I took a video of it. So I got to do a little bit more. I want to read all of it, so all of those surahs, so I could get a full understanding of it. But still, I was like, what the fuck now? As far as reading the surahs, going back to, again, I guess book 4 and starting with verse 157, even though I read, you know, beyond that and also even before that. But reading those surahs, and those surahs and those verses, I'm like, well, books in those verses, you know, they kept saying we. Actually, wait a minute, hold on. What originally brought me to that particular surah, again, I'm assuming book 4, verse 157, is it was something else that I came across, and it was a quote. Actually, yeah, that surah itself, that particular surah in that verse itself. When I first came across it, I just read that verse, and you know, I took it like they were saying, because they mentioned the supposed crucifixion of Jesus. But they was trying to say like it really didn't take place, like the Romans didn't really crucify Jesus. They substituted somebody else in his place and then lied to the people. So that automatically sparked a light bulb in my head, so I followed up with it. But initially I'm thinking to myself, like, they saying this is the official belief from Islamics as well. So I felt like that could have been another exotic detail. So I looked it up. Now, this is where it got a little crazy for me. As I'm reading a verse, and then I started reading beyond the verse, so I went up until 160. I'm like, it seemed like they just automatically switching, like, the order of it didn't make sense. It's like, okay, they started off talking about that, but, you know, they saying they put somebody else in his place, and he didn't really get killed, what actually took place is that after that, God raised him up himself. That's it. And then they go on and they're like, okay, well, you know, the people started disobeying God, so Moses and Aaron, or whatever, Moses showed them signs and this and that, and proved that there's only one God. Yet the people started killing off the prophets. Now, even though, okay, I'm going to explain the order that they explained it before I give my take. Basically, okay, so Moses showed the people, but the people started going against God. Then they started worshiping calves and stuff like that. And so they basically were punished for that. And then that's when they remained in what they mentioned, the mountain, all that type of shit. But basically, you know, based on my understanding of it, more from a Christian point of view, that's when they remained in the desert for about 40 years. Okay, that's before Joshua and all of that. But as far as what they were saying, it's like they after explaining Jesus, that's when they started talking about that. And then after going through that, it transitions, but not even in a smooth fucking way. That's why I'm like, you got to understand the broader context, but I get to that part in a second. When they transition from that point, then they go to the third phase, which is what was going on during Muhammad's time. So they started talking about how the people, you know, start engaging in usurpery and eating stuff that they was not supposed to be eating, basically sinning. Damn, I can't remember the whole thing. Yeah, basically, yeah, they started talking about what was going on in Muhammad's day. But it was a portion that I read even before that. This is when I went in reverse chronological order. So I went as far back as, again, book 4, maybe verse 130. And then I read all the way back up until 157. And then a little bit past that part also. But I still didn't, you know, I'm getting what they're saying, but it's like they jumping from fucking stories and it's not a smooth transition. And I'm almost thinking like, okay, is there like a sub verse within the verse itself? Like, for example, if you got book 4 and you got verse 157, you know, even though it goes 158 and etc., it's like within 157, when you read that particular verse, is there a sub part that's still 157, but it's like a subtext, you know what I'm saying, before it jumps to 158? That's how like the story almost kind of cuts off to me. And then it's like, okay, who the fuck is telling the story? Like, okay, when they started with Jesus, and it was like, yeah, but they did not kill him and this and that. It's like, okay, they're explaining this, but is they explaining this to, like, who are they explaining this to? I'm like, okay, if Muhammad wrote the Quran, why am I getting confused as if, you know, you know what I'm saying? I'm thinking these are his words, basically, you know, with a couple of little infusions in there, but for the most part, you know, you know what I'm saying? I'm thinking he's the ultimate, narrator, but then again, taking into account it wasn't written during this time in the first place. But still, as far as like what I read, I'm like, I'm getting confused. Okay, so going back, it was a part, this would be before verse 157. So this is probably around 140. I'm gonna say around like between 140 and 143. All right, this part they were like, okay, you receive the words of the Lord, you have this knowledge, you have to teach it. It's like they was explaining this to a person, giving them like a script almost, you know, like a game plan, a manual, a formula as to how to operate when it comes to preaching or whatnot. So as I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, maybe this is Muhammad right here speaking to the qazis, or to potential qazis or ministers. Like, okay, if you're gonna go around and you're gonna try to you know, convert people, this is the way to operate. So in reading this particular verse, 140 something, it was like, okay, well, when you get around, you speak, or you hear guys, they use the word recite. when you hear God recite his name or something like that, basically, when you get around people and you want to teach, if they're acting in a, basically they're not trying to hear what you're preaching, then you change the subject, or when the subject is changed, then you go ahead and congregate with them, or you sit around with them and you fellowship with them. You know what I'm saying? Like whatever they talking about, whatever worldly thing or whatever, you go ahead and engage in that. And then when you feel the opportunity, that's when you go ahead and, you know, preach to the people or whatever. But you got to gain these people's trust. That's basically what I read. That was my understanding. But it was also giving a warning, like as far as like followers. Like you'll have some people that'll be watching you as you're doing this, and if you reach the people around you when the opportunity presents itself, and those that was watching you, that was kind of like playing the background, the followers, you know, then they'll try to join in and be like, well, we was on your side the whole time, blah, blah, blah. But if the opposite happens, to where the quote-unquote disbelievers, you know, win the sway over you or whatnot, and those same followers basically gonna go on their side. But the thing is, I caught something when I read that. It was a little bias up in there as far as language, all right? Because when they mention the part about these quote-unquote haters and how they might fucking, you know, basically they're gonna ride the fence the whole entire time. And how, like, if you lose sway and the disbelievers, you know, basically, this ain't the words they use. This is basically what they meant. Disbelievers scorn your ass or somehow shadow you in any type of way, shape, or form. The people that's straddling the fence, you know what I'm saying? When they mentioned that part, and it was like, okay, they're going to basically dick ride the people that overshadow the believer, all right, the potential kazi or whatnot. They was like, okay, those haters will say something like, we stood up for you against the believer. That's the key part. We stood up for y'all against the believer. That's the bias part, the word believer. You know what I'm saying? So whether it's translated exactly like that, is still a fucking bias from the person that authored it originally using the Arabian language, regardless of who it is, whether it's Muhammad or whoever. For them to maintain the word believer, in other words, it's not even interchangeable. They were supposed to put, we stood up for y'all against this. Really can't call them against this heretic, basically. You know what I'm saying? Against this heretic. That's really the key word they were supposed to use, or something synonymous with that. For them to maintain the word believer was a bias thing, because it's like it's still adding justification on an unconscious level to the potential kazi who may be attempting to convey this philosophy to this circle. You know what I'm saying? That was another thing I caught. But anyway, yeah, that part, I'm like, shit, who the fuck they talking to? Okay, maybe Muhammad is telling his potential kazis this is how you got to operate. But then it goes on, and it was like, okay, well, we taught you this. The message that we're bringing on to you is the same message, basically, that we brought to all of the other prophets, including Jesus. And they went all the way back to Abraham. They went from Abraham up until Jesus, basically. All right. So when I'm reading this part, I'm like, okay, this ain't a smooth transition. Again, exactly where this portion is at, I believe it's still 140 something. But even if it's not, that doesn't even matter. When you read it yourself, and again, it's just, you know, this is one of those videos I might not unveil, but you never know. When you read it for yourself, you're gonna see throughout the whole entire fucking, from 130 all the way up until like 160 something. It's not smooth fucking transitions. So I'm like, okay, are these angels talking or God communicating with Muhammad? Because they was saying, they telling him the same thing that they told all the other prophets and messengers, but you know, there's things that they haven't told him, they told to to messengers or conveyed to messengers that he don't even know about. Again, that's another hint that I took. Okay, that's a sign of Muhammad's knowledge. You know what I'm saying? For them to point out something like that within the text itself and say, well, you know, even those messengers that you don't know about, you know. Because I think Muhammad probably was an intelligent dude, at least from a relative standpoint back in the day. So that's another thing that I've caught. Anyway, so shit. So then, you know, they're saying all of this. So I'm like, okay, so these people communicating with Muhammad. And then they also mentioned that I had got something else in my head that I kind of understood as far as like a question that I had. I was somewhat disappointed, but you know, the truth is the truth. It was during this portion that I'm reading, while I'm thinking that this is an angel of a sort speaking to Muhammad, it was also telling him, and this is aside from the we, you know, like they kept saying we, you know, those that were speaking to Muhammad. I'll point that part out, or, you know, speak on what I think about that part in a second. But as far as these people talking to Muhammad, it was like, well, I'm thinking they talking to Muhammad, they were like, God also directly spoke to one of those prophets. I forget who they mentioned, but they highlighted that, you know, within this surah, that God himself directly spoke. Now that's the part I got a little bit more understanding about, like a lingering question in my head, but I was somewhat disappointed. I'm like, damn, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm thinking about Jahiliyyah and the three main deities that they had. But the one in particular that I can remember off top that stands out to me is Allah. I don't think Allah is necessarily just, you know, the same word as Allah. Only because of what's ascribed to this particular deity representing the whole, basically. I thought that was an interesting motherfucking concept. And that's excluding the other two deity. So there's a major difference there between that particular deity, Allah, and those other two ones. So I'm like, okay, there's some type of realistic understanding there that I can sort of gravitate toward and be like, all right, cool. But, and I'm reading this portion again, I'm taking into account that the Quran was written later on. So there may be some exaggerations added. But still, the part when they say God himself, all right, and within this surah they did admit that God is also the heavens and all that type of stuff, but you still can't, you just know I can't like pick and choose on this shit. So they like, God himself also spoke to this particular prophet. I was like, damn. So they kind of do believe that God is a entity in a sense. You know what I'm saying? And then that opens the door for another question. Like, you got to marry that with the omnipresent thing. You know what I'm saying? How you going to do that? You know, it's just, you know, this is just me going deeper into the concept and the historical aspect of it too. The historical aspect is the Nubian thing. I hopefully I got enough time. I'll speak on that in a second. But yeah, I'm like, shit. You know, how you going to marry those two together? But anyway, yeah, I'm like, damn. Maybe, you know, the words got parsed a little bit later, because let me see if I can remember. I think the Quran was written 200 years later after he died, about 200-300 years later. You know, so either the 10th century or the 9th century. That's when it was put together. Or it could have been earlier than that, maybe the 8th century. I don't know, but definitely not during his time. At least 100 years after that. So I'm like, maybe a little bit of this, maybe a little bit of that. You know, because I'm trying to understand, like, somebody that would go to Medina, meet another guy named Huyay ibn Akhtab, and then they supposedly have a back and forth with each other to the point where he said he'll never like Muhammad, and he came back one time drained from a conversation that they basically had because they shared somewhat differences of opinion as far as religions. Obviously, Muhammad most definitely coming from the belief system of Jahiliyyah, but being familiar with the Christian notions. So he having a conversation with him, I don't understand how it could be so draining if it is true that Muhammad do also perceive of God as being a man at the same time. You see what I'm saying? That's like a major key. It is weird, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, so that's one of the exotic things. Now, as far as the fucking weed part, I'm like, who is this weed? It remind me of a song with Cannabis, Channel Zero, when he said, first of all, who is they if God was truly a single entity? That's not what he was saying. Very basically quoted when the first verse of Genesis, let there be light, something like